My name is David Parsons, and I'm here to introduce Robertson. First, a brief word about the John Coffin Memorial Bequest. This benefaction came to the University of London under the will of the late Mr. Arthur Charles Coffin in memory of his father John. Mr. Coffin was concerned that we shouldn't lose sight of music, the arts, and what might be termed the cultural aspects of education. And the Coffin bequest is devoted to the funding of lectures in literature, history, and Christian ethics, to readings of prose and poetry, to chamber concerts and recitals, and to the publication of reports by the Institute of Education. I would also to say that this evening's reading takes place in association with the Poetry Book Society. We often hear, too often hear, about poetry revivals in this country, that poetry has become suddenly popular, that there's a vigorous poetry scene, that a great deal of strong and admirable poetry is being written. It might well be that there are a lot of people writing poetry, but the harsh fact is that at any given time, there are few really gifted poets at work, and this evening's reading will be given by one of them. Since you'll be hearing the poem shortly, I'm not going to attempt to characterize Robertson's work, except perhaps to say that it's definable as the real thing in the way that it tends to resist analysis. That's not to say that it can't be approached critically, but rather that what's admirable in it is the instinctive sureness of hand and tone that gift provides, qualities that serve and inform, in Robertson's case, a compelling and unique vision. It's this that has won him the E.M. Forster Award and allowed him to make a clean sweep of the Ford Prizes in all categories. And it's a pleasure now to ask him to give the John Coffin Memorial reading. Robertson.
Tinsel. Tune to the frequency of the wood and you'll hear the deer breathing, a muscle tensing, the sigh of a field mouse under an owl. Now listen to yourself, that friction, the push and drag, the double pulse, the drum. You can hear it clearly. You can hear the sound of your body breaking down. If you're very quiet, you might pick up loss, or rather the thin noise that losing makes, perdition. If you're absolutely silent and still, you can hear nothing but the sound of nothing. This voice and its wasting, the soul's tinsel. Listen. Listen. Well, as we're all here because of Eliot, I should own to sharing some of his early interests. Metaphysical poets, fertility, symbolism, use of the vernacular voice. I'm not sure, though, that I would want to purify the dialect of the tribe. I think I might just want to celebrate it. And it's in that spirit that I'll read the next poem. It's one of a series of invented Scots narratives that I've been writing recently. Narratives that share some common thematic ground with the Celtic folk tradition. That is to say, their everyday stories of murder, rape, suicide, madness, and some magic and witchcraft thrown in. This is the first of these, by Clachan Bridge. I remember the girl with the hare lip down by Clachan Bridge, cutting up fish to see how they worked. By morning's end, her nails were black-red, her hands all sequined silver. She unpuzzled rabbits to a rickle of bones, dipped into a dormouse for the pit of its heart. She'd open everything, that girl. They say they found wax dolls in her wall, pockets full of human hair, but I'd say they're wrong. What's true is that the blacksmith's son, the simpleton, came down here once and fathomed her, claimed she licked him clean as a whistle. I remember the tiny stars of her hands around her belly as it grew and grew, and how, after a year, nothing came. How she said it was still there inside her, a stone baby. Now I saw her wrists bangled with scars, and those hands flittering at her throat to the plectrum of bone she'd hung there. As to what happened to the blacksmith's boy, no one knows, and I'll keep my tongue. Last thing I heard, the starlings had started to mimic her cry, and she'd found how to fly. Here's one for Sean O'Brien, and we described it as obscene. It's called Wonderland, and Tim Burton's new film doesn't have this scene in it, but I think it would have been a better film if it had. Wonderland. She said her name was Alice, that she'd studied with the geisha in Japan and was trained and able in the 1,000 ways of pleasuring a man. We'd share some shots of whiskey, her favourite brand, Black Label. Then she'd knock them back and drink me under the table. And here's something similar from my first book. And it has a different instruction on the label. Instead of drink me, it would say eat me. Artichoke. The nubbed leaves come away in a tease of green, thinning down to the membrane, the quick purple beginnings of the male. Then the slow hairs of the heart, the choke that guards its trophy, its vegetable goblet. The meat of it lies displayed, upended, al dente, the stub root aching in its oil. What the horses see at night. When the day birds have settled in their creaking trees, the doors of the forest open for the flitting drift of deer among the bright croziers of new ferns and the legible stars. Foxes stream from the earth. A tawny owl sweeps the long meadow. In a slink of river light, the mink's face is already slippery with yolk, and the bay's tiny islands are drops of silver under a drogue moon. The sea's a heavy sleeper, dreaming in and out with a catch in each breath, and is not disturbed by that first in a play of herring, a shoal silvering open the sheeted black skin of the sea. Through the starting rain, the moon scurs across the sky, dragging torn shreds of cloud behind. The fox's call is red and ribboned in the snow's white shadow. The horses watch the sea climb and walk towards them on the hill. Hear the bull crying under the alder, our children breathing slowly in their beds. My girls. How many times have I lain alongside them, willing them to sleep after the same old stories, face to face, hand in hand, till they smooth into dream and I can slip these fingers free and drift downstairs, my face a blank, hands full of deceit. This is a poem about time, called About Time. In the time it took to hold my breath and slip under the bath water, to hear the blood thud in the veins, for me to rise to the surface, my parents had died. The house had been sold and now was being demolished around me, wall by wall, with a ball and chain. I swim one length underwater, pulling myself up on the other side, gasping, to find my marriage over, my daughters grown and settled down, the skin loosening from my legs and arms, and this heart going like there's no tomorrow. Two elegies. Ghost of a Garden. Sometimes I discover I have gone downstairs, crossed the grass, and found myself in here, the tool shed, caught in a lash of brambles, bindweed, and tall ivied trees like pipe cleaners. It looks out vacantly on a garden run to seed, the lost tennis court, grown over benches, a sunken barbecue snagged with blown roses. The courtyard walls are full of holes the swallows try to sow in and out of them like open doors. In the corner of the shed, my father is weeping, and I cannot help him because he is dead. And the second is for a friend of mine, a friend of David's, a friend of May, who died at the age of 50, Michael Donaghy. He was a wonderful poet and an extremely talented musician. He was an Irish-American who lived over here, and he was dearly loved. And the poem is called Selkie. Selkie in Celtic mythology is a creature that lives as a seal in the ocean, is able to transform itself, shed its skin, and walk up onto the beach as a human. And there's a drum mentioned here, the bowron, which you probably know, but those who don't, it's an Irish frame drum. Selkie, in memory of Michael Donaghy. I'm not stopping, he said, shrugging off his skin like a wetsuit, then stretching it on the bowron's frame. Let's play. And he played till dawn, all the jigs and reels he knew, before he stood and drained the last from his glass, slipped back into the sealed skin, into a new day, saluting us with that famous grin. That's me away. You probably noticed already that I'm quite interested in metamorphoses, and indeed I've been imitating of it during the course of the last 4 books. I often think that the greatest shape changers of all, though, are children. And this is for my elder daughter, it's about her at the end of the summer, at the end of her childhood, on a beach in the west of Ireland. Donegal, forever. Ardent on the beach at Rosnala on the last day of summer, you ran through the shallows, throwing off shoes and shirt and towel like the seasons, the city's years, all caught in my arms as I ploughed on behind you, guardian still of dry clothes, of this little heart, not quite 13, breasting the waves and calling back to me to join you, swimming in the Atlantic on the last day of summer. I saw a man in the shallows with his hands full of clothes, full of all the years, and his daughter going where he knew he could not follow. Eliot remarked somewhere that some editors are failed writers, but so are most writers. Being like Eliot, an editor and a writer, I seem to have had more than my fair share of failure. And I even put together an anthology called Mortification, Writers' Stories of Their Public Shame, in which David Harsland, I have to say, was a star turn. But there was another writer, if he'd been available, I would have loved to have asked him to contribute, and that's August Strindberg. I'm very fond of the Swedish playwright and artist, alchemist, less for his work perhaps, more for the catastrophe of his life. He was a misogynist and feminist in equal measure, and his dealings with women do make for alarming reading. His second wife, Frida, woke the day after their marriage to find Strindberg strangling her, and when she quite reasonably remonstrated with him, he said, "Oh, I'm terribly sorry, I thought you were my first wife." This poem is set a few years earlier in the early 1890s, when Strindberg was in exile in Berlin, having left his wife and his children, and he was beginning his experiments with alchemy, but really he was spending most of his time drinking in this pub with Edvard Munch and Knut Hamsun and various women, including a beautiful young Norwegian, and an affair with a young Austrian, Frida, who he later married and tried to strangle. Strindberg in Berlin. All the wrong turnings that have brought me here, debts, divorce, a court trial, and now a forced exile in this city, in this drinking cell. Zum schwarzen Ferkel, the black piglet, neither home nor hiding place, just another indignity, just a different make of hell. Outside, a world of people queuing to stand in my light, and that sound far in the distance of my life labouring to catch up. I've now pulled out every good tooth in search of the one that was making me mad. I squint at the flasks and alembics, head like a wasp's nest, and pour myself 3 fingers and a fresh start. A glass of aquavitae, a straightener, stiffener, a universal tincture. Same again. The great purifier, clarifier, a steadying hand on the dancing hand. One more, if you wouldn't mind. Bringer of spirit and the spirit of love, the cleansing fire, turning lead to gold, the dead back into life. The pole at the piano, of course, Monk opposite me, his face like a shirt done up wrong. My fiancée in one corner, my lover in another, merging, turning as all women turn, back into my daughters. And I'm swimming naked at night off the island in the witch fire of Marel light, listening to the silence of the stars with my children beside me, my beautiful lost children in the swell of the night, swimming beside me. And back to the bright salts and acids, the spill and clamour of the bar, the elixirs, the women, my wife-to-be, my young lover, one banked hearth, one unattended fire. Christ, the hot accelerant of drink, the rot of desire. And out into the swinging dark, a moon of mercury, lines of vitriol trees, and the loose earth that rises up, drops on me, burying me night after night after night. And here's a very short, blissfully short poem about another complicated man whose writing I admire enormously. Those of you familiar with the work of the great Scots poet Hugh MacDiarmid will also remember his reputation as an impossibly difficult, cantankerous man, not given to humour or easy sensuality. I never met him, I'm sorry to say, but in this poem I imagine an encounter that both of us would have found excruciating. The Tweed. Giving a back rub to Hugh MacDiarmid, I felt through the tweed so much tension in that determined neck, those little bony shoulders, that when it was released, he simply stood up and fell over. I'm going to read, took the liberty of reading a couple of new poems. This is the first. It's another Scots narrative. Under Ben Riven. 3 moons in the sky the night they found him drowned in Salton's bog. Just his cap sitting there and his wee fat hands poking out. It was no loss to the village, I told them next morning, no loss at all, and most folk agreed. Horned aft he was, havering and glycate and scaring children. I mind that time he picked up a mouse and ate it quickly, 2 mouthfuls, set the tail aside on the ground like a cocktail stick. I used her well after that, his Jenny, still in her widow's weeds, gilping into her whenever I could, in the barn or the boathouse or off in the fields. She slipped 2 or 3 out at least, and sank each one in a lobster creel. Her head was away by the end, as mad as her man, and no good to me. She sleeps now under Ben Riven, her face covered in ivy, scab, and sticky willow. The dreams came then. Last night, the burning loch, so full of bairns they bobbed to the surface with their hair on fire. Black snow, fingers coming through the floorboards, rain like razor blades. The fusty-faced man there at every corner, hands furred with grey mold. And her, as always, star naked, hatching in the herring nets. The last I remember was my body being driven with sticks through the town to Sawton's Brae and hanged. I broke from sleep and sat up sweating, dream flayed in the dark. I groped around for the matches, and the matches were put in my hand. I once had to share a house with a dying cat. It's not something I particularly recommend. Bits were falling off this cat, and it wasn't easy for either of us. Anyway, I got a poem out. Cat failing. A figment, a thumbed maquette of a cat, some ditched plaything, something brought in from outside, its white fur stiff and grey, coming apart at the seams. I study the muzzle of perished rubber, one ear eaten away, his sour body lumped like a beanbag, leaking thinly into a grim towel. I sit and watch the light degrade in his eyes. He tries and fails to climb to his chair, shirks in one corner of the kitchen, cowed, denatured, ceasing to be anything like a cat. And there's a new look in those eyes that refuse to meet mine, and it's the shame of being found out. Just that. And with that loss of face, his face, I see, has turned human. Here's a sad hotel poem. A restless night in one night. Cheap hotel poem. Kind of still life in sonnet form. It's called Tulips. Sifting sand in the Star Sign Hotel on 96th and Madison, trying not to hear the sirens, the heart's fist, desire's empty hand. The room awash with its terrible light, a sky unable to rain. Cradling a glass of nothing much at all, it's all come down to this. The electric fans stop-start, the stalled half-circle twist of draft over bed, the sea spill of sheets, the head in storm. Look at what's beached here on the nightstand, a flipped photograph and a silk scarf, a set of keys. These tulips loosening in a vase. And here's one of about the same length, where things work out a little more satisfactorily. Rainmaker. Tentative rain, and the light is changing, the water ticking in the leaves, pattering the sheets as she turns to him, murmuring, slow and ready for the verge of flood, the undertows hard covenant, the run of trust. She feels something unfurling in a glut of dew, a finger pushing into a peach water welling over fern and fruit. She tastes the the curve and ache in the weather. He unhooks her, and leaning in, he starts to make her rain. It's the second new one. It's called The Shelter. I should have gone back outside when the storm passed and the autumn light returned. I could make out shapes and hear occasional sounds, a muffled crying which I took for wind in the trees, a stuttering wasp at the windowsill. I listened. What looked like a small red coat was dripping from its wire hanger. I went towards the fitful shift and rustle in the bucket there in the corner by the door to find inside a crumpled fist of balled up paper, slowly uncrinkling. On the hearth, just legible in the warm ash, my name and dates. And above that, in a shard of mirror left in the frame, I caught sight of myself wearing something like a black brooch at the neck. Then I looked more closely, and I saw what it was. I thought I'd read my version of the eighth canto of the Inferno. That'll cheer you up. Not all of it. It's a very truncated, free version. It's just I really wanted to offer a nod to Eliot's debt to Dante. So we're in the seventh circle of hell, along with the tyrants and assassins and warmongers. But it's also where we find the wood of the suicides, the self-killed who have been transformed into stunted, gnarled trees, and in whose branches the harpies roost. These are foul bird-like creatures with human faces, and they tear at the trees and defecate on them. At the time of the final judgment, the bodies of the suicides will be allowed to hang from the branches. With a very short prose introduction, then one of the suicides describes the arrival of Virgil and Dante before he addresses them directly. The wood of the suicides. Beyond the barking of the damned in the Red River, before the phosphorus sand, another dark wood. A tangle of thorn and bitter leaves, torn at by women with the feet of birds, perched there in the barren trees they dismember and defile. A descant rises under their shrieks and the batter of wings, a low, encroaching moan of grief. The groans of millions fill the ruined wood. Two men have come amongst us, sightseers, voyeurs. One takes the twig of my finger in his hand and snaps the bow. The pain is sudden and remote. I am run through by flame. The stump starts to sweat and sputter like a green reed, half in, half out of the fire, one end burning, the other bubbling air and sap and blood, whistling, spitting out words. You know now what I am. Like you, poet, I was expelled from my own land, but unlike you, I could look no longer on what I saw and killed what hurt me. I closed my own eyes. And for this crime I was banished from my body. It lies in the upper ground, while my soul was tossed like a seed into this deep hole and has grown to a tree. Like you, poet, these creatures come to rest in my limed branches, destroying them, giving pain, and giving pain a voice. They say that on the final day I can claim my skin, that being self-killed can never wear it. I will drag it down here as the butcher bird and skewer my body on my soul's thorn. And you have heard my story and can leave as you leave all the lost. I made my home my hanging tree. Now let me drop. I'll just read four more. Moving vocation from hell to the Mediterranean, you'll be relieved to hear. The first describes snorkeling in Greece. I don't imagine you have me down as a snorkeler. Diving. The sudden sea is bright and soundless, a changed channel of dashed colour, scrolling plankton, sea darts, the slope and loom of ghosts. Something slow and grey, sashaying through a school of cobalt blue, thin chains of silver fish that link and spill and flicker away. The elements imitate each other. Water light playing on these stones becomes a shaking flame. Sunlight stitches the rockweed's rust and green, swaying, sea wavering. One red twist scatters a shoal like a dust of static, a million tiny shocks of white dissolving in the lower depths. The only sound is the sea's mouth and the ticking of the many mouths that feed within it, sipping the light. Dreaming high over the sea forest, the seabed green as a forest floor, through the columns of gold and streams of waterweed, above a world in thrall, charting by light as a plane might glide, slowly, silently, over woods in storm. I was in Liguria last spring, just south of Geneva, and I spent much of my time walking the sea cliffs in a sort of Montale kind of a way. And this is a poem about that. And it's dedicated to my wonderful Italian translator Massimo Bacciagallipo tonight. It's called Widow's Walk, and that is comes from a Scottish expression. Widow's Walk was a platform or high ledge above the harbour where the wives of the fishermen would watch to see if their husbands would return. Widow's Walk. On the Passeggiata on the rocks at the Maranella bar again, losing what remains of my language to a thickening rain, a week of rain that's almost stopped the sea. Trying to escape myself, but there's always someone wanting to sew my shadow back. The fisherman on his rock under the red flags has two fish in his bucket, swimming nowhere, side by side. Lines of lacquered beetles are rowing boats turned upside down. The sea, mother of pearl and broken shells. The furled parasols, Madonnas in their shrouds. I walk here amongst the very old. We watch the paint flake from the hotel walls, and I take note once again of the sign spelt out in English, bathing in, not sure, for lack of rescue servage. I felt like going in, there and then, like a widow toppling forward at the grave, going in after myself. And the penultimate poem is about that business of chasing the sun at the end of the summer, trying to get the last ray. It's set in Sicily. It's a love poem, and it's for Karen. Abandon. That moment when the sun ignites the valley and picks out every bud that screamed that afternoon, when birds spill from the trees like shaken sheets, that sudden loosening into beauty, the want in her eyes fleet blue, the medals of light on water, the way the water intrigued about her feet, the ocean walking her out into its depth, sea lighting the length of her from the narrow waist to the weight of the breasts, the way she lifted her eyes to me and handed me back, simplified. That moment, at the end, knowing the one I had abandoned was myself, edging with the sun around the bay's scoop of rocks, rolling the last gold round the glass, that shelving love as the sun was lost to us and the sky bruised and the stones grew cold as the shells on the beach at Naxos. So I've finished now with enormous thanks to David Harsland for introducing me, a poet I admire enormously, and to Ron Schuhart for inviting me, to you all for coming. This is another Scottish narrative which I've invented. It's called At Your Own Head. You'd know her house by the drawn blinds, by the cormorants pitched on the boundary wall, the black crosses of their wings hung out to dry. You'd tell it by the quicken and the pine that hid it from the sea and from the brief light of the sun, and by Angus, the collie, lying at the door where he died, a rack of bones like a sprung trap. A fork of barnacle geese came over with that slow squeak of rusty saws, the bitter seas complaining, cool and roll, a whicker of pigeons lifting in the wood. She'd had 4 sons, I knew that well enough, and each one wrong. All born blind, they say, slack-jawed and simple, web-footed, rickety as sticks. Beautiful faces, I'm told, though blank as air. Someone saw them once outside, hurtling down to the shore, chittering like rats, and said they were fine swimmers, but I would have guessed at that. Her husband left her, said they couldn't be his, they were more fish than human, said they were beglamoured, and searched their skin for the showing marks. For years she tended each difficult flame, their tight, flickering bodies. Each night she closed the scales of their eyes to slure the fire. Until he came again, that last time, thick with drink, saying he'd had enough of this, all this witchery, and made them stand in a row by their beds, twitching, their hands flapped, herring eyes rolled in their heads. He went along the line, relaxing them, one after another, with a small knife. Said she goes out every night to lay blankets on the graves to keep them warm. It would put the heart across you, all that grief. There was an otter worrying in the leaves, a heron loping slow over the water when I came at scrape of day back to her door. She'd hung 4 stones in a necklace, wore 4 rings on the hand that led me past the room with 4 small candles burning, which she called the room of rain. Milky smoke poured up from the grate like a waterfall in reverse, and she said my name, and it was the only thing and the last thing that she said. She gave me a skylark's egg in a bed of frost, gave me twists of my 4 sons' hair, gave me her husband's head in a wooden box. Then she gave me the sealskin, and I put it on.